What if one of the deadliest nights in American history didn't start with just one fire, but many? Same night, different cities, hundreds of miles apart, all burning. Officially, it was wind and drought, but witnesses described something else. Fires moving too fast, appearing too suddenly, even strange lights in the sky. Maybe it was nothing, but the deeper you look at October 8, 1871, the harder it becomes to believe it was just a coincidence. On the evening of October 8, 1871, a fire broke out in a small barn on the southwest side of Chicago. That much is certain. The location is usually identified as the property of the O'Leary family, though even that detail has been debated for decades. Early newspaper reports named a cow kicking over a lantern as the cause. Later investigations questioned the story. Some historians now consider it apocryphal, an invention that simplified a far more complex disaster. What cannot be debated is what followed. Within hours, the fire expanded beyond anything the city had ever experienced. By the time it was over, more than 3 square miles of Chicago had been destroyed. An estimated 17,000 buildings were reduced to ash. Around 100,000 people, nearly 1/3 of the city's population, were left homeless. The event would later be known as the Great Chicago Fire. Official reports from the period, including those preserved in the archives of the Chicago Historical Society, describe a city uniquely vulnerable to fire. Buildings constructed largely of wood, streets lined with wooden sidewalks, a summer of drought that had left everything dry and combustible. Strong winds pushed flames rapidly through densely packed neighborhoods. These factors are well documented. They are also, in many ways, sufficient. The simplest explanation is often correct. And yet, even in the immediate aftermath, observers struggled to fully explain the fire's behavior. Eyewitness accounts describe flames that seemed to leap across streets and rivers. Firebrands, burning fragments carried by the wind, ignited rooftops far from the main blaze. Entire blocks appeared to catch fire simultaneously. At one point, the fire crossed the south branch of the Chicago River, a body of water assumed to act as a natural barrier. Reports suggest that debris and oil on the river's surface may have allowed flames to spread across it. Still, the speed was unusual, the intensity was extreme, and the timing raised questions. Because Chicago was not alone, on that same night, October 8, 1871, massive fires erupted in multiple locations across the American Midwest. In Peshtigo, a firestorm consumed entire towns, killing an estimated 1,500 to 2,500 people in what remains the deadliest wildfire in United States history, the Peshtigo Fire. In Michigan, fires swept through forest regions and settlements, including areas around Holland and Manistee. Dozens of communities were affected. Thousands were left homeless. In Wisconsin, beyond Peshtigo, additional fires burned through rural areas. Multiple large-scale fires across different states on the same night. This was not unknown in a dry season. The autumn of 1871 had been exceptionally arid across the region. Land clearing practices, where farmers burned brush to prepare fields, had left smoldering fires scattered throughout the countryside. All it took was wind, and on October 8th, the wind came. Still, some contemporaries found the simultaneity unsettling. Newspapers at the time speculated cautiously. Editorials noted the coincidence. Some mentioned atmospheric conditions. Others hinted at something less defined. Not a theory, just a question. Why that night? Meteorological records from the era, limited though they are, suggest a powerful low-pressure system moved through the region, generating strong, sustained winds. These winds could have fanned numerous small fires into uncontrollable infernos simultaneously. That explanation is widely accepted today. but it does not fully account for some of the stranger details recorded by witnesses. In both Chicago and Peshtigo, survivors described unusual fire behavior. In Peshtigo, reports speak of fire whirls, tornado-like columns of flame that moved unpredictably through forests and towns. Some described superheated air that ignited clothing and structures almost instantly. Modern fire science recognizes such phenomena as possible under extreme conditions: high heat, low humidity, intense wind, fuel-rich environments. The ingredients were present. But there are other details. In Chicago, observers reported that certain areas ignited before the main fire front arrived. Buildings appeared to catch fire from within, as if heat had accumulated invisibly before bursting into flame. In Peshtigo, survivors described moments when the air itself seemed to burn. Accounts vary in reliability. Memory under stress is imperfect. Language struggles to capture extreme experiences. Still, the consistency of certain descriptions across different locations is difficult to ignore entirely. Then there is the matter of light. Several witnesses across the Midwest reported seeing unusual brightness in the sky before or during the fires, descriptions of glowing or streaking lights. Some accounts mention what they interpreted as meteors. At the time, these observations were not widely emphasized. They appeared in scattered reports, often overshadowed by the immediate devastation. Later, they would attract more attention. Perhaps they were unrelated. Perhaps they were ordinary astronomical events misinterpreted under stressful conditions. Or perhaps they were simply coincidence. The fires themselves left little room for speculation in the moment. Entire communities were erased. In Chicago, the fire burned for more than 24 hours before rain finally helped extinguish it. In Peshtigo, the firestorm moved so rapidly that many victims had no time to escape. Afterward, investigations focused on practical explanations: weather, urban design, human error, combustible materials. These factors remain central to modern understanding of the disaster. And yet, the fact remains. On a single night in 1871, multiple catastrophic fires erupted across hundreds of miles, behaving in ways that even contemporary observers struggled to fully explain. Maybe it was nothing more than a perfect convergence of conditions: dry land, open flame, relentless wind. But the pattern, the timing, the scale, the shared characteristics invites a deeper look. Because when separate events begin to align too closely, the question is no longer just what happened in one city. It becomes something broader. What exactly was happening across the entire region that night?
What was happening across the Midwest that night was, on paper, entirely explainable. A dry summer had left forests brittle and cities vulnerable. Farmers had spent weeks clearing land using controlled burns. Lumber operations had filled the air with sawdust and debris. Small fires smoldered across rural areas, often left unattended. All of it waiting. Then came the weather. Meteorological reconstructions suggest a powerful cold front swept through the region on October 8, 1871. Winds intensified rapidly. Gusts carried embers across long distances. Fires that had been small and manageable became something else: uncontrolled, self-sustaining, violent. In Peshtigo, the transformation was immediate. What began as scattered brush fires combined into a single firestorm. The flames generated their own wind systems, drawing in oxygen and intensifying heat. Entire forests ignited at once. Survivors described a sound like a freight train, a roar that did not stop. The Peshtigo fire burned so intensely that it created fire whirls, rotating columns of flame capable of uprooting trees and hurling debris through the air. Some victims sought refuge in rivers, only to succumb to boiling water and superheated air above the surface. In Chicago, similar forces played out in an urban environment. Buildings constructed of wood, tar, and pitch became fuel. Streets lined with lumber yards accelerated the spread. At one point, the fire leapt the Chicago River. Official explanations point to floating debris and oil residue igniting on the water's surface. It is plausible. Still, witnesses described flames moving in ways that felt unpredictable. Entire rooftops igniting ahead of the main fire, sparks traveling blocks at a time. Fire, wind, fuel. The pattern repeats. Across Michigan, fires broke out in multiple locations that same night. In areas near Holland, Manistee, and Port Huron, communities reported sudden outbreaks that quickly overwhelmed local firefighting efforts. The scale is difficult to visualize. Hundreds of miles, multiple states, fires igniting and intensifying within the same narrow window of time. And then there are the smaller reports, scattered references in newspapers and personal accounts describing unusual atmospheric conditions, a haze, a strange brightness, in some cases a yellow or reddish tint to the sky before the fires reached full intensity. These details are not consistent across all accounts. Some may be exaggerations. Others may reflect normal optical effects caused by smoke and particulate matter. But they appear often enough to form a pattern at the edges of the record. Around this point, one particular idea begins to surface, usually mentioned cautiously, often dismissed just as quickly. It involves a comet, specifically fragments of a comet or meteor swarm passing through Earth's atmosphere around the same time as the fires. The theory gained attention decades later, most notably through the work of amateur researcher Ignatius L. Donnelly, who suggested that debris from a disintegrating comet may have ignited fires across the Midwest. The argument points to several observations: reports of falling debris, unusual lights in the sky, the simultaneity of fires across a wide region, and the apparent intensity of combustion. Modern scientists have largely rejected this explanation. There is no physical evidence linking cometary material to the fires. The energy required to ignite widespread fires from atmospheric debris would likely have produced more obvious impact evidence. The official explanation remains grounded in terrestrial causes: weather systems, human activity, environmental conditions. The simplest explanation is often correct. Still, the comet theory persists, not because it is strongly supported, but because it attempts to unify the pattern. Multiple fires, same night, similar behavior, a single cause. Perhaps that impulse to find a singular explanation is part of the story itself. Because the historical record does not present one clean narrative, it presents layers, practical causes at ground level, atmospheric conditions above, human decisions throughout, and eyewitness accounts that occasionally drift beyond what can be easily categorized. Even within the accepted framework, the fires of October 8, 1871 were extreme. Firestorms of that scale are rare. Simultaneous firestorms across multiple states are rarer still. Modern firewild science acknowledges that under certain conditions, high winds, low humidity, abundant fuel, fires can behave in ways that appear almost unnatural. They generate their own weather, they create their own wind systems, they move faster than expected. Perhaps that is enough, and yet something about the convergence remains unsettling, not because it defies explanation entirely, but because it sits at the edge of explanation. A moment where multiple systems, natural, human, environmental, aligned with unusual precision. And in that alignment, entire communities were erased in a single night. The records that remain are fragmented: official reports, newspaper articles, personal accounts, each one capturing part of the event, none of one capturing all of it. And that leaves space, not necessarily for alternative explanations, but for lingering uncertainty.
History often preserves outcomes more clearly than experiences. We know how many buildings were destroyed in the Great Chicago Fire. We know how many lives were lost in the Peshtigo Fire, at least approximately. We know the sequence of events as reconstructed through official reports. What we do not fully retain is what it felt like to be inside those hours. The accounts that survive suggest something difficult to reduce to statistics. In both Chicago and Peshtigo, survivors described disorientation, light behaving strangely, heat that seemed to arrive before flame, air that burned the lungs before fire touched the skin. Language becomes strained in these descriptions. Words like whirl, storm, and furnace appear repeatedly. Fire not as a line moving across land, but as an environment, something that surrounded, something that changed the rules. Modern fire science provides frameworks for understanding these experiences. Firestorms, convection columns, ember storms. These are real, documented phenomena. But understanding is not the same as familiarity. Even today, such events remain rare enough that they feel anomalous when they occur. In 1871, they would have felt almost incomprehensible. And perhaps that is where the deeper uncertainty begins, not in the cause, but in the perception. When events exceed the boundaries of everyday experience, memory struggles to organize them. Details blur, sequences collapse, observations take on symbolic weight. A strange light in the sky becomes more than a visual detail. It becomes part of an attempt to explain something overwhelming. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was simply smoke reflecting distant fire, or atmospheric distortion under extreme conditions. But once recorded, such details remain, small anomalies embedded in larger narratives. The fires also left gaps in the physical record. Entire towns in Wisconsin and Michigan were destroyed so completely that documentation vanished with them. Local archives burned, personal records disappeared. In some cases, even the layout of communities had to be reconstructed from memory. This creates a different kind of silence, not absence of explanation, but absence of detail. We know the fires happened. We know they were devastating. But for many of the places affected, the fine-grained record, the day-to-day life before the fire, the exact sequence of destruction, is incomplete, lost to the same event it might have explained. Chicago rebuilt quickly. Within years, new structures rose from the ashes. The city became a symbol of resilience and modern urban planning. But in smaller communities, especially those affected by the Peshtigo fire, recovery was slower. Memory lingered longer than infrastructure. Stories passed down, details softened, certain elements emphasized, others forgotten. And over time, the fires of October 8, 1871 became both well-documented and strangely distant, a known event with unknown edges. Maybe I'm connecting dots that were never meant to touch. It is possible that everything about that night can be explained through known factors, weather patterns, land use, human error, and the physics of fire. In fact, that is the prevailing conclusion. But even within that conclusion, there is room for unease. Not because something supernatural occurred, but because of how easily conditions aligned to produce something so total. Multiple fires, multiple states, one night. A convergence that erased entire communities and left behind a record that is both detailed and incomplete. We inherit the reports. We inherit the conclusions. What we do not inherit is the full texture of that night, the precise way the air felt, the exact sequence of ignition, the small details that might have clarified the larger pattern. Those details existed once, in letters, in local records, in the memories of people who did not survive long enough to record them. And so the story remains stable at its center and uncertain at its edges. A disaster explained, but not entirely contained. A night defined by fire, documented in numbers and narratives, yet still carrying fragments that resist neat categorization. Somewhere between the official reports and the scattered eyewitness accounts, there is a version of that night that no longer exists in full. Not lost completely, but thinned, reduced, preserved in pieces, like embers that burned brightly for a moment, then disappeared into the dark, leaving only traces in the records that survived.